Picture this. The fierce warriors who once ruled the seas, feared from England to Constantinople, suddenly disappear from history. The Vikings, their longships, their raids, their sagas, fade into the shadows. How could a culture so mighty, so unforgettable, just end? What happened to the last Vikings? Did they die out? Did they change? And why don't we hear about them after the 13th century? This is one of history's greatest transformations. And today, we're diving deep into the story of the last Vikings. 1. The beginning of the end. By the 11th century, the Viking Age was slowing down. But here's the thing, this wasn't a sudden collapse. It was more like a slow fade, with the Vikings adapting to a changing world. For centuries, Viking warriors thrived on raiding. Their longships carried them across the seas, striking fear into the hearts of kings and villagers alike. But by the early 1000s, the golden age of raiding was coming to an end. Why? The main reason was resistance. European kingdoms like England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire were no longer easy targets. They had learned from the Viking raids and built stronger defenses. Castles, standing armies, and better organized governments. The Vikings, once unstoppable, faced tougher and tougher challenges. And it wasn't just about defense. Many Viking leaders realized they could gain more through trade and alliances than through raids. Why risk everything in a raid when you could strike deals, marry into power, or even rule entire kingdoms? 2. From raiders to rulers. The Vikings were no longer just seafarers. They were becoming landowners and rulers. Take Knut the Great, for example. In the 11th century, this Viking king ruled over a vast empire that included England, Denmark, and Norway. He wasn't pillaging towns. He was governing them. But here's the twist. As Vikings settled down, they started blending in. They adopted the customs, languages, and religions of the lands they ruled. In Normandy, for instance, Viking descendants became the Normans, famous not as raiders but as conquerors of England in 1066. Does that sound like the end of the Viking spirit? Not yet. Let's keep going. 3. The rise of Christianity. If there's one thing that truly changed the Vikings, it was Christianity. By the 11th century, most of Scandinavia had converted to the new faith. But let's be clear, this wasn't just about religion. It was about survival. Pagan Vikings were seen as outsiders, even enemies by Christian Europe. Leaders like Olaf Tryggvason of Norway and Harald Bluetooth of Denmark realized that converting to Christianity wasn't just a spiritual choice. It was a political move. Becoming Christian opened doors to alliances, trade, and legitimacy. But it also meant letting go of the old ways. No more temples to Thor or sacrifices to Odin. Slowly but surely, the Norse gods were replaced by churches and monasteries. This was a cultural shift. The bold, free-spirited Viking way of life was being tamed. But even as their religion changed, their adventurous spirit didn't die. It simply found new outlets. For Greenland and Iceland, the final strongholds. Let's talk about the edges of the Viking world, Greenland and Iceland. These distant lands are key to understanding the last Vikings. Greenland was settled in the late 10th century by Eric the Red, a bold explorer who was exiled from Iceland. Life there was brutal. The settlers farmed in a harsh climate and depended on trade with Europe. But over time, trade routes shifted, and Greenland became isolated. By the 14th century, the settlements had vanished. What happened? Theories range from climate change to conflict with the Inuit people. But one thing is clear. Greenland's Vikings were among the last to cling to the old ways, and their disappearance marked the end of an era. Iceland, on the other hand, survived and thrived. Here, Norse traditions were preserved longer than almost anywhere else. The Icelandic sagas, epic stories of Viking heroes, were written down, keeping their legacy alive. 5. The last Viking king. Now, let's meet one of the last great Viking kings, Harald Hardrada. If anyone embodied the Viking spirit in the 11th century, it was him. Harald was a warrior, a traveler, and a leader. He fought in battles across Europe, served in the Byzantine Empire's elite Varangian Guard, and eventually claimed the throne of Norway. In 1066, he tried to conquer England, leading a daring invasion. But at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, Harold's army was defeated and he was killed. This battle is often seen as a symbolic end of the Viking Age. But the story doesn't stop there. 6. The final chapter, 1263. The real end of the Viking era came in 1263, with the death of King Haakon IV of Norway. He led a failed campaign to defend Norwegian territories in Scotland, including the Hebrides. The Battle of Largs wasn't a huge defeat, but it marked the moment when Norway turned inward, leaving behind its Viking ambitions. After Haakon's death, the age of Viking expansion was over. Scandinavia became more like the rest of Europe, focused on trade, diplomacy, and centralized rule. The Viking spirit of raiding and exploration had given way to something new. 7. The Viking legacy. So, what happened to the Vikings? They didn't disappear, they adapted. They traded their longships for farms, their axes for crosses. They became part of the societies they once raided. But their legacy lives on. From the sagas of Iceland to the Norse influence on language, place names, and even modern pop culture, the Vikings continue to fascinate us. They remind us of a time when the world was wild and full of possibilities, a time when a single longship could change history. And that's the story of what happened to the last Vikings. They didn't vanish. They evolved, leaving behind a legacy that still shapes our world today. If you enjoyed this journey through history, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button. There's so much more to explore, and we'd love to have you along for the ride. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.